If I were you, Margaret, I would seriously consider leaving your husband. Those were the first words Dr. Emily Carter said after staring at the ultrasound screen for far too long. And in that small, softly lit exam room in suburban Ohio, time seemed to slow to a quiet, suffocating crawl. Margaret Whitmore, 63 years old, sat upright on the narrow medical bed, her hands folded neatly over her cardigan, the paper sheet beneath her crinkling as she shifted slightly, confused but composed. She had scheduled the appointment expecting nothing more than routine reassurance, a simple follow-up to address some abdominal discomfort that she had blamed on stress. She had always been practical like that, never dramatic, never one to assume the worst. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender air freshener, and the late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting narrow bolus of light across the tiled floor. Dr. Carter, a woman in her early 40s with calm eyes and a steady voice, did not look like someone prone to exaggeration. Yet her expression had changed the moment the image appeared on the screen. She dismissed the nurse gently, closed the door, and pulled her stool closer to Margaret, lowering her voice as if the walls themselves could overhear. Margaret's mind did not jump to betrayal at first. It moved instead through practical explanations, insurance errors, mixed files, harmless anomalies. She had been married to Daniel Whitmore for just under 3 years. After losing her first husband to a heart condition, she had not expected to fall in love again, especially not at 60. Daniel had seemed attentive, patient, even grateful to share a life with someone who owned her own 2,400 square foot home outright and managed her finances carefully. He had insisted on handling certain paperwork after their wedding, telling her she deserved to rest after decades of responsibility. At the time, she interpreted it as devotion. Sitting there now, however, she replayed the past several months with unsettling clarity. Daniel stepping outside to take late-night phone calls, the unexplained transfers from their joint checking account, the way he had grown unusually interested in her medical records and beneficiary documents. Dr. Carter turned the monitor slightly toward her, pointing to details that did not align with the information Daniel had provided during previous visits. There were inconsistencies, subtle but undeniable, the kind that suggested someone had supplied altered history. "I can't discuss everything without your authorization," Dr. Carter said carefully. "But you deserve to know when something doesn't add up." Margaret felt a chill, not from fear, but from recognition. She had spent decades raising a son, managing a household, volunteering at church, and navigating the quiet politics of family gatherings. She understood when a tone shifted, when a story contained seams. As the reality settled in, she did not cry. She did not panic. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, thanked the doctor for her honesty, and asked for copies of every document tied to her file. Because in that moment, Margaret Whitmore realized the ultrasound was not revealing a medical emergency. It was revealing a marriage built on something she had never thought to question, and for the first time since her wedding day, she began to wonder whether the greatest threat to her well-being had been sleeping beside her all along. Margaret drove home from the clinic with both hands steady on the steering wheel, her mind far calmer than her pulse. The late afternoon traffic moved slowly along the familiar 2-lane road lined with maple trees, and she noticed how ordinary everything looked, how unchanged the world remained despite the quiet fracture forming inside her marriage. When she pulled into the driveway of her light gray colonial house, the one she and her first husband had purchased nearly 35 years earlier, she sat in the car for a full minute before turning off the engine. The house stood solid and dignified, 2 stories, white shutters, a porch that stretched nearly 20 feet across the front. It had always represented stability. Now it felt like evidence. Daniel's truck was already parked in the driveway. He had come home early. That detail did not escape her. Margaret stepped inside and found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. He looked up with an easy smile that once would have reassured her. "How did the appointment go?" he asked, casual, almost rehearsed. Margaret placed her purse on the chair and removed her coat slowly, buying herself time. She studied his face, searching for a flicker of concern that matched the gravity she had just experienced. There was none, only expectation. "Routine," she answered evenly. She had always believed that truth revealed itself best in silence. Daniel nodded, returned to his phone, and mentioned that he might need to step out later to handle an errand. Another errand. Margaret walked upstairs to their bedroom, closed the door gently, and sat at her oak writing desk. She removed the envelope of printed medical records that Dr. Carter had provided and laid them out in neat rows. The discrepancies were subtle but undeniable. Dates that did not align. Information that suggested someone had accessed her files with authority she had not granted. She opened her laptop and logged into her online banking account, something she had not reviewed in detail for several weeks because Daniel had assured her he was managing upcoming property tax payments. As the numbers populated the screen, her expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened. There were transfers she did not recognize, amounts just under $10,000, spaced carefully over several months. Not reckless, not obvious, but deliberate. Margaret reached for the folder in her desk labeled estate planning. She had updated her will shortly before marrying Daniel, trusting his suggestion to simplify certain beneficiary designations. Now she scanned the documents with a precision that came from decades of balancing household budgets down to the dollar. A new clause had been inserted regarding survivorship rights to the property. It had been explained to her as standard marital protection. Tonight it read differently. Downstairs she heard Daniel moving through the kitchen, the clink of a glass, the low hum of the television turning on. Margaret closed the laptop and folded her hands in her lap. She did not feel rage. She felt clarity. The ultrasound had not revealed illness. It had revealed intention. And Margaret Whitmore understood that before she confronted a single word, she needed to understand the full design of the man who believed she was no longer paying attention. Margaret did not sleep much that night, but she did not toss or turn either. She lay still beside Daniel, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, studying the ceiling fan as it rotated in slow, even circles above them. Nearly 3 years of marriage rested between them in that king-sized bed, yet the distance felt wider than the 12 inches separating their pillows. Around 2 in the morning, Daniel's phone vibrated softly on the nightstand. He reached for it quickly, more quickly than someone half asleep should have been able to move. The screen lit up his face in a pale glow. He angled it away from her before slipping quietly out of the bedroom. Margaret kept her eyes closed until she heard the faint click of the back door downstairs. Only then did she sit up. She did not follow him. She did not need to. Instead, she reached for her reading glasses and picked up her own phone. Earlier that evening, she had changed the password to her primary email account, something Daniel had once helped her manage. Now she began the careful process of recovering access to an older shared cloud storage account they had used for tax documents. It took patience, but Margaret had always possessed more patience than people realized. Within 20 minutes, she was scrolling through archived files Daniel likely assumed she would never revisit. There were scanned copies of forms she did not remember signing, digital drafts of property agreements, and correspondence with a financial advisor whose name she did not recognize. The tone of the emails was polite, professional, and disturbingly strategic. They referenced long-term asset protection, contingency planning, and projected equity based on her home's estimated value of $680,000. Margaret felt a tightening in her chest, not from panic but from insult. The language in the emails referred to her as a variable, a factor in a calculation. Not a partner, not a wife, a position to be secured. When Daniel returned to bed, he slipped beneath the covers with a sigh, unaware that the woman beside him had just stepped into a different version of her life. Margaret lay back down and allowed him to settle. She watched the faint outline of his profile in the darkness and remembered the afternoon he had proposed on her own front porch, telling her she deserved companionship and safety. She realized now that he had studied her stability long before he studied her heart. By morning, she had already formed a plan. She would not accuse him. She would not reveal suspicion. Instead, she would confirm every detail. After breakfast, while Daniel showered, Margaret placed a call to the attorney who had originally drafted her will years before she remarried. His office was still located 3 miles from her home, in a modest brick building near the courthouse. She scheduled a private consultation for the following afternoon. Her voice remained calm, almost cheerful. As she hung up, she glanced toward the hallway where Daniel was humming under the running water. The sound echoed through the house she had paid off long before he arrived. Margaret Whitmore understood something clearly now. If there was a design unfolding around her, She intended to read every line of it before anyone realized she had turned the page. The following afternoon, Margaret parked her sedan in front of the small brick law office she had passed hundreds of times over the years without imagining she would one day return under these circumstances. The brass plaque beside the door still read Harrison and Cole Attorneys at Law, the same firm that had helped her and her first husband draft a simple, straightforward will when they were in their 40s. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, smoothing the sleeve of her navy blazer, steadying her breathing. She was not walking in as a frightened wife. She was walking in as the sole owner of a fully paid $680,000 property and decades of accumulated savings. Inside, the receptionist recognized her name and offered a polite smile. Within minutes, she was seated across from Thomas Harrison, now in his late 60s, his silver hair neatly combed, his memory surprisingly sharp. He greeted her warmly and asked how married life had been treating her. Margaret returned the smile, measured and courteous. Then she placed a slim folder on his desk and said she needed to review every amendment made to her estate plan since her remarriage. As he scanned the updated documents, his expression shifted in subtle stages, much like Dr. Carter's had the day before. He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the page detailing survivorship rights and property transfer provisions. "Did you request this modification personally?" he asked carefully. Margaret held his gaze and answered honestly that she had signed what was presented to her, but had not drafted the language herself. Thomas Harrison nodded slowly. He explained that the clause effectively granted Daniel significant control over the home should anything happen to her, including authority to liquidate certain assets. Margaret listened without interruption. She asked precise questions about timing, filing dates, and notarization. When he pulled the official records, it became clear that the amendments had been scheduled through an intermediary appointment that she did not distinctly remember arranging. There was nothing illegal on the surface. Everything had been processed through appropriate channels. Yet the pattern mirrored the financial transfers she had discovered the night before. Structured, incremental, strategic. Margaret requested copies of all filings and asked what steps would be necessary to restore the estate plan to its original structure. Thomas Harrison outlined options: revoking amendments, establishing a trust solely in her name, limiting spousal access to certain accounts. The legal language was firm, protective, and entirely within her rights. Margaret felt a quiet steadiness return to her posture. She was not unraveling a mystery. She was mapping it. Before leaving, she authorized the immediate preparation of new documents and scheduled a follow-up signing for the end of the week. As she stepped back into the cool Ohio air, she noticed how clear the sky appeared, a wide blue stretch without a single cloud. Daniel had likely assumed that familiarity bred complacency, that comfort dulled awareness. What he had miscalculated was Margaret's memory. She remembered every signature she had ever placed on paper, and now she intended to ensure that every future signature would belong solely to her. Margaret returned home that evening with a folder of certified copies resting neatly inside her leather tote, her expression as composed as it had been when she left. Daniel was in the living room, watching a financial news program, the glow of the television reflecting off the framed photographs lining the mantel. There were pictures of her late husband, her son as a teenager, family holidays that predated Daniel's arrival. He muted the volume when she stepped inside. "You were out longer than usual," he observed lightly. Margaret removed her shoes, aligning them carefully beside the door. "I had a few errands," she replied, her tone warm but neutral. She moved through the house with quiet ownership, touching the back of a dining chair, adjusting a stack of mail, grounding herself in the familiarity of a space she had maintained for decades. During dinner, Daniel spoke about refinancing options he had been researching, mentioning that interest rates might shift and that consolidating certain assets could be wise. He framed it as protection, as foresight. Margaret listened attentively, nodding at appropriate moments, asking small clarifying questions that encouraged him to elaborate. The more he spoke, the clearer the architecture of his plan became. He had positioned himself as indispensable, slowly, centralizing control over documents, accounts, and communications. After the dishes were washed and the kitchen lights dimmed, Margaret excused herself to her study. She closed the door softly and powered on her desktop computer. The new documents from Thomas Harrison would be ready for signature within 2 days, But tonight, she had another task. She contacted her bank directly and requested a private appointment with a senior account manager, citing concerns about unauthorized structural changes to her portfolio. The representative assured her that safeguards could be implemented immediately, including dual authentication requirements and transaction alerts exceeding $1,000. Margaret authorized them without hesitation. She then drafted a brief, formal letter revoking any financial power of attorney previously granted to Daniel, ensuring it would be notarized alongside her revised estate plan. There was no trembling in her hands as she typed, only precision. Downstairs, she heard Daniel moving about again, perhaps preparing another late call, perhaps reviewing his own calculations. Margaret leaned back in her chair and allowed herself a single, quiet realization. He believed she was unaware. He believed comfort had made her careless. What he had underestimated was her capacity for stillness. She did not need confrontation to feel powerful. She needed documentation. By the time she turned off the light and walked toward the bedroom, the balance had already shifted, though Daniel did not yet know it. The house stood silent around them, its hardwood floors polished, its foundation steady. Margaret understood that foundations only crack when ignored, and she had no intention of ignoring anything ever again. 2 days later, Margaret returned to the law office to sign the revised documents, arriving 10 minutes early with the same calm expression she had perfected over decades of hosting church luncheons and neighborhood gatherings. Thomas Harrison walked her through each page carefully, explaining how the new trust would hold the title to her $680,000 home exclusively in her name, and how the revocation of financial authority would become effective immediately upon notarization. Margaret listened to every word, not because she doubted him, but because she wanted the weight of each decision to settle fully in her mind. When she signed her name in steady blue ink, she felt neither anger nor triumph. She felt alignment. The notary stamped the final page, the raised seal pressing firmly into the paper, and in that quiet office the structure of her future shifted back into her control. Before leaving, she instructed Thomas Harrison to file the documents without delay and to provide certified confirmation copies directly to her personal mailing address, not the shared post office box Daniel occasionally checked. That detail mattered. On the drive home, Margaret stopped at her bank for the scheduled meeting with the senior account manager. In a private office with glass walls and a small American flag resting on the desk, she formalized the transaction alerts and placed temporary restrictions on any withdrawal exceeding $5,000 without in-person verification. The manager assured her that the safeguards would trigger immediate notification if any unusual activity occurred. Margaret thanked her politely and left with a folder tucked neatly under her arm. That evening, Daniel greeted her with an unusual degree of enthusiasm, suggesting they review their long-term financial strategy together over coffee. Margaret agreed with a gentle smile. They sat at the kitchen table where she had once helped her son with algebra homework years earlier. Daniel opened his laptop and began outlining projections, speaking confidently about shared retirement goals and possible property restructuring. Margaret watched him with careful attention. She noticed how often he used the word we when referring to assets she had built long before their marriage. When he proposed scheduling an appointment with a different financial planner the following week, Margaret nodded thoughtfully and said she would check her calendar. Inside, she recognized the timing. He was accelerating. Perhaps he sensed subtle resistance. Perhaps the safeguards were already complicating his access. After he went to bed, Margaret remained at the table for a few minutes, tracing the grain of the wood beneath her fingertips. She was not reacting impulsively. She was allowing him to continue revealing the full extent of his intentions. Because now that her documents were secure and her accounts protected, she could afford patience. And patience, she knew, often encouraged the truth to surface on its own. The notification arrived on a quiet Thursday morning while Margaret was watering the small row of hydrangeas lining her front porch. Her phone vibrated gently in the pocket of her cardigan, and when she glanced at the screen, she saw an alert from her bank regarding a flagged transaction attempt exceeding $5,000. She did not rush. She finished pouring the water carefully, set the metal can down beside the steps, and then opened the notification. The attempt had been initiated through online access from a device requesting a transfer of $12,800 to an external account. The request had been temporarily suspended pending verification. Margaret's expression did not change. Instead, she walked back into the house, closed the front door, and placed her phone on the kitchen counter. Daniel was seated at the table, his laptop open, a half-finished cup of coffee beside him. He looked up with mild surprise when she entered. "Everything all right?" he asked, studying her face as if searching for clues. Margaret nodded slowly. "The bank called about a security check," she said evenly. "They wanted to confirm a transfer." Daniel's hand paused on the trackpad. For a fraction of a second, his posture stiffened. "Oh," he replied, attempting a light laugh. "That must have been the reallocation we discussed. I thought it would process automatically." Margaret pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, folding her hands calmly on the table. "The bank has updated its policies," she explained. "Any transfer above $5,000 now requires in-person authorization from me." She allowed the sentence to settle between them. Daniel leaned back in his chair, masking his irritation with a measured smile. "Well, that is inconvenient," he said. "We should probably streamline things again." Margaret held his gaze, her voice gentle but unwavering. "There will not be any more streamlining." Silence filled the kitchen, thick but controlled. Daniel closed his laptop slowly. "Margaret, we are married. We are supposed to trust each other." She inclined her head slightly. "Trust is built on transparency," she answered. "And I am reviewing everything." The words were not an accusation. They were a declaration. Daniel's jaw tightened, though he quickly smoothed his expression. He began explaining market timing, investment opportunities, shared futures. Margaret listened without interruption, but internally, she noted every shift in tone, every attempt to reposition the narrative as mutual benefit rather than personal gain. When he finished, she stood and gathered her purse. "I have an appointment this afternoon," she said calmly. "I will be finalizing some documents." Daniel asked what kind of documents, but Margaret simply smiled. "The kind that ensure clarity." As she stepped out the door, she understood that the design he had carefully constructed was beginning to crack under its own weight. He had made his move, and she had anticipated it. Margaret spent that afternoon in Thomas Harrison's office once more, reviewing the final confirmations that her revised trust had been filed and recorded with the county. The certified copies were placed into a sealed envelope bearing her name alone, and she instructed the receptionist to ensure that any future correspondence would require direct identification before release. When she stepped back into the parking lot, the autumn air felt sharper, cleaner, as if the world had quietly shifted into focus. She did not drive home immediately. Instead, she stopped at the county records office and requested a public copy of her property title to confirm that the transfer into the trust had been properly reflected. The clerk processed the request efficiently, sliding the stamped document across the counter. Margaret studied the page carefully. Her name stood alone as trustee. No ambiguity. No shared authority. That evening, Daniel was waiting in the living room, pacing slightly when she entered. He had abandoned the relaxed posture he usually performed. "We need to talk," he said, his voice controlled but strained. Margaret set her purse down and removed her coat with deliberate calm. "Yes," she replied gently, "we do." He began with questions about the bank alert, about the new restrictions, about the appointment she had mentioned. His tone shifted between frustration and persuasion, as though he were testing which approach might regain influence. Margaret listened without interruption. When he finished, she walked to the hallway table and retrieved the sealed envelope. She placed it on the coffee table between them. "I have restructured my estate plan," she said evenly. "All assets acquired prior to our marriage are now secured under a trust solely managed by me." Daniel stared at the envelope but did not touch it. The color drained slightly from his face. "You did this without discussing it with me," he said quietly. Margaret met his eyes with steady composure. "You made financial moves without discussing them with me." The words were not sharp. They were factual. Silence stretched across the room, heavy but contained. Daniel attempted to argue that everything he had done was for their shared future, that he was protecting them both. Margaret did not raise her voice. "Protection does not require secrecy," she answered. She then explained that she had also revoked any prior financial authority and implemented independent oversight on all accounts. Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly, the confidence that once framed his posture beginning to dissolve. For the first time since the ultrasound appointment, Margaret saw uncertainty in him. Not anger, not dominance, Uncertainty. She rose from the couch and walked toward the staircase. I believe it would be wise for us to evaluate this marriage honestly, she said calmly, without assumptions. As she ascended the stairs to her bedroom, she understood that the balance had fully shifted. The structure he had quietly constructed over months had been dismantled in less than a week. And now, standing alone in a house secured by her own foresight, Margaret was no longer uncovering a plan. She was concluding it. The next morning the house felt unusually quiet, as though even the walls understood that something irreversible had taken place. Margaret rose before sunrise, dressed carefully in a soft gray sweater and pressed slacks, and walked downstairs to prepare coffee as she had done for years. The routine steadied her. Daniel emerged nearly an hour later, his expression guarded, his usual confidence replaced by calculation. He began to speak, but stopped when he noticed a neatly arranged stack of papers on the dining table. At the top rested a formal document prepared by Thomas Harrison, outlining a petition for legal separation and the division of marital assets strictly limited to property acquired during the 3 years of their marriage. Margaret remained seated, hands folded calmly, her posture upright. I have consulted counsel, she said evenly. This is the most reasonable path forward. Daniel scanned the first page, his breathing growing heavier though he kept his voice measured. He argued that she was overreacting, that financial misunderstandings did not warrant dismantling a marriage. Margaret listened without interruption. When he finished, she spoke quietly. A misunderstanding happens once. A strategy unfolds over time. The distinction settled heavily between them. She explained that she had already secured her trust, her accounts, and the title to the home. The separation terms offered him a modest settlement reflecting shared expenses, nothing more. There was no anger in her tone, no raised voice, no accusation beyond documented facts. Daniel's shoulders lowered gradually as the realization set in that there was no leverage left to negotiate. The safeguards, the filings, the alerts, the revoked authorities all formed a structure he could not bypass. For the first time since their wedding, Margaret saw him without performance. He asked quietly whether there was any possibility of reconciliation. Margaret held his gaze for a long moment. Trust, she said gently, requires honesty from the beginning. She stood and walked toward the front door, opening it to allow in the cool morning air. The maple trees lining the street glowed faintly in the early light, steady and rooted. Daniel gathered a small suitcase later that afternoon, moving through the rooms with subdued silence. Margaret did not follow him. She remained in the living room, reviewing a final confirmation email from her bank stating that all protections were active. When the front door closed behind him, there was no dramatic sound, only the soft click of a latch settling into place. Margaret walked slowly through the house, touching the polished banister, the framed photographs, the solid oak dining table. Nothing had been taken from her. Nothing had been broken. The ultrasound appointment that once seemed routine had uncovered more than a medical question. It had revealed intention. And by choosing patience over panic, documentation over confrontation, Margaret Whitmore had ensured that the life she built over decades remained entirely her own. In the quiet that followed, she felt neither bitterness nor regret, only clarity. And clarity, she understood, was the strongest protection of all.